Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the final webinar in our 2022 Soil Health Series. Today, we've got a great lineup of speakers joining us to talk about the hot topics in soil health and what the future holds for this kind of research. Before we get started, I'd like to just share some reminders. The first being that we are offering 1 hour of nutrient management CCA CEUs, and the certification information will be available at the end of today's program. Today's session is also being recorded, so you can review the recording from today or any of our past webinars on our Ag Crops YouTube channel. We are going to hold the questions until the end when all of our speakers are finished, but please use the Q&A feature to enter any questions that you have throughout the program, and we'll answer those at the end. We would like to practice giving you guys the opportunity to chat with your fellow attendees and the panelists. So open up the chat, make sure that it's toggled to select all panelists and attendees, and give us the answer to the question, what soil health research would you like to see in the future? We're going to use these ideas that you're entering so that we can help make sure that we're focusing in on topics that matter to you. So thank you for your feedback. I'd like to dive right in. We have 5 excellent speakers joining us today to share their current research on hot topics in soil health. To introduce our first speaker, he's Dr. Steve Coleman, an associate professor in the School of Environment and Natural Resources. And he's going to share his work looking at the results from long-term no-till plots in Ohio. So I'll hand it off to you now, Steve.
Hi, my name is Steve Coleman, and I'm going to talk a little bit for the next few minutes about some of our work to summarize and fully understand the impact of 50 plus years of no-till and crop rotations with Ohio's long-term experimental plots, okay? So these are the Triplet Van Dorn no-tillage and crop rotation experiment. We have these at 2 sites at Worcester and Wayne County in Northeast Ohio, and at the Northwest Ag Research Station, also known as Hoytville in Wood County in Northwest Ohio. These were established in 1962 and 1963 respectively. These sites were, and it's really the oldest no-till experimental plots from a research perspective, okay? They both contain 3 tillage treatments of a no-till chisel and a plow till, and 3 crop rotations of a continuous corn, soybean, and then a corn, oat, forage, and forage. So it's a 3-year rotation with corn grown and then oat as a nurse crop with some sort of mixed grass forage perennial, okay? So we'll just get into it. First one, I just want to talk about corn yields at Northwest. Okay, so here's the location. And this is basically from 1960, for Northwest, it's 1963 to 2018. So we've analyzed these data up to 2018, okay? And so again, we've got here our continuous corn treatments in the left-hand column, our corn soybean in the middle column, and on the right is the corn forage. The tillage are essentially represent the rows, and we've got moldboard plow across, conventional tillage or chisel till, and then our true no-till. So again, there's a lot here. There's a lot of information, a huge amount of work to manage and maintain these experiments over the last nearly 60 years at this point. Okay. And so for a very simple kind of broad stroke, what we did is we took this and we essentially fitted a line through this. So we took all these points and we fitted the kind of the best fit line through this. This is a regression line of sorts. And because there's a lot of variability from year to year, you can see this clearly. And we wanted to ask these questions about what were the best yielders over time, and what did we actually see which treatments or set of treatments did we see good improvements, okay? And so for the next set of graphs, I'm basically going to collapse these 3 tillages of moldboard plow, conventional tillage or chisel till, and no-till on each other, and just extract these lines, okay? So that's what this graph represents. Again, our 3 crop rotations across the top here. And then these tillages are represented with the red line as a moldboard plow, conventional till as a green, and then the no-till as a blue long dashed, okay? And what I did is I just took and I extracted the slopes from each one of these lines on. So in other words, how many bushels were increasing every year, okay? And we can see across these, the graph, again, this is at Hoytville, that, for example, continuous corn, for the no-till plots, they were yielding very poorly. And then over time, the rate of increase has really increased. So a 0.9 bushel per year relative to the plow of 0.6 or 0.2 means that we're yielding more bushels over time, okay, in that no-till plot. And then again, we can see the difference between the corn soybean and then their corn forage treatments. Again, 1.4 bushels per year on average since the start of the experiment versus the chisel till, which is 1.3, and the moldboard plow 1.2, okay. Not surprisingly, the corn forage treatment was a greater yielder overall, represented by these higher lines relative to the continuous corn, okay. I'm going to go and I'm going to show you the Worcester corn now. Same set of graphs from Wayne County. This is a lighter soil, okay, a silt loam soil relative to the clay loam soil in Hoytville. Here's our data again. Looks very similar. Same type of design in terms of the layout. Again, we've put regression lines through each one of these, and then we collapse them on each other to see what this site looked like, okay? And so some similar trends, but a little bit different depending on continuous corn here, where moldboard plow actually had the greatest rate of increase. No-till started well, but then you can see that it's kind of not gaining yields to the same extent as these two tillage treatments. We get into the corn soybean. It's different than when no-till has been kind of the best yielder in corn soybean corn, and then corn forage. Again, the no-till is the best yielder and has maintained essentially a 1.6 bushel increase per year in that no-till, okay? Again, across all three rotations, the corn forage is the highest yielding treatment, okay? So we can look at these are just the same two graphs I showed you put in the same slide here. And that in general, increasing yields, increasing the crop rotation, increase yields, okay? And so in other words, corn forage typically out yielded either the corn, soybean, or the continuous corn, all right? And that plow had, not always, but for most of the treatments, plow tillage had the lowest rate of yield gains, and that no-till had the highest rate of yield gains across these rotations, okay? So in other words, not only is tillage as a treatment, essentially the no-till treatment provided kind of the best bang over time in terms of the number of bushels increased on a per year basis, okay? Now, very briefly, I want to just go into a little bit soil health and talk about what the impacts of the management. I just showed you yields, but what about how that looks like in terms of soil properties, okay? So let's talk about this. Now, it's a little bit set up. This is soil, and it's set up a little different. There's a lot here, so let me walk you through it. So we sampled soil at 6 different times: at pre-plant, at V5 when corn is at V5 growth stage, V10, R1, this is essentially tasseling, R6, and then physiological maturity at R4, and then physiological maturity at R6. Okay, we've got our different crop rotations, and then the tillages nested within that, of red being moldboard plow, chisel till, and no-till, and then our sites. Okay, so what does this mean? There's a lot of information here. Soil moisture, of course, being a very important parameter over time in terms of what that means for plant productivity. And we can see that doesn't seem to be too much difference between the continuous corn and corn soybean at the Northwest site. But boy, oh boy, there's a big difference, a lot more soil moisture throughout that growing season with the no-till in this corn forage rotation. Worcester's a little bit different story, where we actually see greater soil moisture basically across all the years. And we'd expect with lack of tillage, there'd be greater soil porosity and more well-developed pore structure and tilth. And so that would have the capacity to store soil water much greater than, say, these tilled treatments, okay? So important implications of soil moisture on plant productivity over time. Soil respiration, this is how much carbon dioxide is blown off over time. And we can see large differences in tillage treatments. At Northwest in particular, Worcester is a little bit different. In general, Northwest tillage had a larger effect than crop rotation. But interestingly, in these lighter textured soils in Worcester, crop rotation had a larger effect than tillage, okay? Now I'm just gonna move on and end here with that both tillage and crop rotation impacted yields in soils. Generally that the yields in corn and soybean, I didn't show you soybean data, but more no-till, more yields with no-till and more diverse crop rotations. And with soil health, some of the soil carbon data is a little bit different in terms of which practice, crop rotation or tillage, had a greater impact. At Worcester, crop rotations were more important than tillage, and at Hoytville, tillage more important than crop rotation. So, and then the no-till with the corn forage, in other words, having that print on the crop rotation really yielded the greatest net return in terms of yields and soil health. Okay, so that's the kind of the breadwinner treatment in this entire experiment, has been for many, many years now. So whether that's, we can talk about profitability and all that, but we know that these long-term management practices have had fundamental and foundation effects on soils, and then that translates into yields. I'm going to stop there. Be happy to take any questions and look forward to sharing more of this data with you as it becomes available. Thank you.
Thanks, Steve. I think it's really interesting to see those yield trends in the long-term no-till plots compared to some of the other management practices. Our next speaker is Dr. Soledad Benitez-Ponce, and she is an assistant professor in plant pathology. And today she's going to share her work looking at microorganisms and soil health.
Hello, everyone. My name is Soledad Benitez-Ponce. I'm an assistant professor at the Department of Plant Pathology at Ohio State University. My laboratory specializes on studies of communities of microorganisms associated to plants and their impact in soil and plant health. As we think about the concept of soil health compared with soil quality or soil fertility, one of the differences is that it incorporates biological processes that contribute to ecosystem function. These processes are mediated by organisms. We know that these organisms live in association with plants in different areas in the soil, and also that microorganisms are an important part of them. Microorganisms contribute to soil health through different mechanisms, including a cycling of nutrients, plant residue decomposition, carbon accumulation and sequestration, as well as through specific plant microbial interactions that can contribute to plant health, as well as microbial interactions that can result in inhibiting plant pathogens. When I talk about microorganisms, I'm referring to those organisms that are not visible to the naked eye, and these include fungi, bacteria, nematodes, protists, and viruses. Among them, we can find some of them that are involved in nutrient cycling, others that are involved in decomposition, also some that can promote growth, and several that can cause disease as well. Since many years ago, researchers have been documenting how different management practices promote soil health. As part of this research, we have also learned that how we manage our soils is going to affect the communities of microbes that's present within, and this also gets back into their contributions of microorganisms to soil health. So there is a loop, a feedback loop between management practices, microorganisms, and soil health. Specifically, it has been documented that those practices that tend to promote soil health, such as no-till and cover crops, result in increased microbial measures, including measures of microbial diversity, microbial biomass, and microbial activity. I would like now to define these three measurements. Microbial diversity refers to the number and type of different microbes present in a soil. So we can determine diversity by culturing and naming individual microorganisms in the laboratory, or by studying the total DNA present in a soil sample, and from there naming all the different types of microbes present within. This will result in generating a list of organisms, a number of different types of organisms that we can compare across soils and relate to soil health. Second comes measures of microbial abundance. Microbial abundance tells us how many microbes are present in a particular soil. For example, we can use a counting of microorganisms growing in the laboratory. We can use measures of microbial biomass or microbial carbon, but we can also use measurements that could tell us abundance of a specific group of organisms that could be of interest for soil health. In this table here, I'm showing you an example of abundance of 5 different groups of microbes present across 3 different soils, which was estimated with a method that uses characteristics of the cellular composition of microbes. And third come measurements of microbial activity. These measures focus on what microbes can be doing in the soil. What are microbes doing in the soil? So we can have, for example, experiments in the greenhouse where we inoculate individual microbes to test the effect of plant growth. We can also have experiments in which we look at the total DNA of a soil sample and characterize the number of genes that are present on the soil as a function of, as an expression of their activity. But we can also look at different enzymes and enzymatic activity that could be occurring in soil, and those enzymatic activity could be linked to specific nutrient cycling functions. So for example, beta-glucosidase is an enzymatic assay that can be used for understanding carbon cycling across different types of soils. A very important aspect of these 3 different types of measurements is that any comparisons we do regarding microbial communities, they have to be done at a smaller scale because microbial communities are context dependent. We know that soil type is a very important factor in determining microbial community composition and activity, as well as other environmental factors. So our ability to compare across very big scales with microorganisms is still something that we're working on. So let me tell you briefly about some of the research we do in our laboratory. In our laboratory, we currently use tools that look at microbial diversity and the individual types of microbes that are present in a soil sample. In this research, we work closely with Dr. Laura Lindsay in the Department of Horticulture and Crop Science. And for the past 4 years, we have been working in this field experiment that she and her team established in 2013 in 2 different locations in Ohio. This experiment is looking at the effects of a corn-soybean wheat rotation in crop yield, also soil health, as well as bacterial communities. From this experiment, we have observed that the 3-year rotation has resulted in consistent increases in organic matter, and those increases were significant in the year 2018, where the corn-soybean wheat rotation resulted in greater organic matter than the corn-soybean rotation. These results are correlated with the observation that soybean yield also tends to be higher in the corn-soybean winter wheat rotation, with significance observed in one of our site years studied. Next comes our research in bacterial communities. So in this figure here, I'm showing you a summary of a bacterial community and bacterial diversity within soil samples that were collected from the corn-soybean winter wheat plots, as well as corn-soybean plots across 2 different sites in 2019. So each individual data point here represents a particular soil sample. The triangle shape indicates the rotation treatment being 3 years, and the color red indicates the site being the northwestern site. What we can observe from this figure here is that if we look in the vertical axis, we see a separation of samples that are from 3-year rotation versus 2-year rotation. And on the horizontal axis, we observe a separation of samples across sites. So that indicates us that both site and rotation contribute to the diversity of microbes in these two experimental stations that we're currently studying. In addition to that, we can correlate the bacterial community composition with organic matter and yield data that we have. And again, using this information, we can then generate hypotheses which types of microbes are really influencing the benefits of the 3-year rotation. So to summarize what I've talked to you today, we know that microbes are important to soil health, and this contributes, and this occurs through interactions with carbon accumulation and other organisms in the soil. We know that we can describe microorganisms using different methods, and that all these methods have shown that practices that promote soil health result in greater microbial activity, microbial diversity, and microbial abundance. And also, I show you an example of how we're using this information in our research to inform about the benefits of corn soybean with rotation in Ohio. I'll be happy to answer any questions in the live session of this session. Thank you.
Thanks, Soledad. The connection between microorganisms and soil health has been something that the group attending this webinar has been very interested in. So it's nice to see the work that you're doing is helping us better understand that relationship. Our next speaker is Dr. Ryan Hayden. He's an associate professor of soils and agronomy at ATI up in Worcester. And Ryan's going to share some of the research they're conducting with interseeding cover crops into corn. So I'll hand it off to you now, Ryan.
Hello, my name is Dr. Ryan Hayden. I'm a faculty member at Ohio State's Agricultural Technical Institute in Worcester. And today I'd like to highlight some of the research that I've been doing on soil health in regards to strategies for interseeding cover crops into corn. And I really want to focus on some of the opportunities and challenges that we've observed through some of our research. So as many folks know, there are a lot of benefits to planting cover crops. We can use them to prevent soil erosion, to fix nitrogen, and to generally just enhance soil health more broadly. But one of the big drawbacks for integrating cover crops into corn and soybean rotations is some of the challenges we have with limited window of opportunity for planting cover crops after harvesting our grain crops of corn and soybeans and so forth. So surveys throughout the Midwest have consistently highlighted this as a major barrier to wider cover crop utilization. So my work on interseeding is basically designed to try and address this challenge and look at some of the different opportunities we have for planting cover crops at different times during the year. So one technical strategy that we've been looking at is the use of a high clearance drill. This is an interseeder that was manufactured in Pennsylvania, and there's other companies designing similar types of equipment that allow a farmer to plant cover crops in between standing crops of corn or soybeans using a drill that enhances seed soil contact. And this, in theory, should help us to lessen our dependence on timely rain and result in more consistent establishment. And in the case of this seeder, the optimal time to interseed is kind of in corn is between V3 and V6. And the benefit there is at that stage of the growing season, you can plant a really wide range of cover crops and still have sufficient time for them to get established. And then when you take the corn off, you've got a cover crop already there on the ground that can be there to enhance your soil health. So downside is it does require some specialized equipment, and depending on the size of the drill, it can be slow in covering larger acreages. And as you'll see in some of our research, it's still to some extent weather dependent in terms of being able to get good emergence establishment. So in this set of experiments that we looked at, we asked several important questions. First, we wanted to make sure that we did no harm, and that we wanted to see if competition from the cover crop had any possible reductions in our grain yields, which would be a negative consequence of planting that cover crop. We also wanted to follow it for subsequent years to see if the cover crop improved yields of future crops. And then we also wanted to examine what cover crop species might be most successful under a corn canopy, which admittedly is a pretty challenging growing environment for that cover crop. So just want to give you a little highlight from some work that we did in Ohio. We basically planted several cover crops. We and compared those to a control with no cover crops, and then we planted these cover crops into corn at the V5 stage in this case. The 3 cover crops that we tested were tillage radish, red clover, and balanza clover. And we measured cover crop biomass in the fall after we took the grain off. We also measured grain yield. And then we repeated the experiment in the same plots the following spring, where we planted, we tilled in the cover crops before we planted corn, and then we interseeded the same cover crops, again later on that corn growing season at the V5 stage. And then we measured grain yield again the following year. And one thing that I should note is in that first year of the study, which was 2015, we didn't see any significant differences between the cover crop, the interseeded cover crop treatments, or the control, which had no cover crop. In fact, in several cases, we saw marginally higher yields in the plots that had cover crops. The cover crops all established reasonably well in the fall. And then in the spring, the red clover and the balanza clover overwintered pretty well. The tillage radish did not, which is to be expected. It is something that would normally winter kill. And then we looked at grain yields the following year. In those same plots, we did corn back to corn because that gave us an opportunity to see if there would be some potential benefits to the corn from the cover crop. And we found excitingly that in all of those cover crops, we did see some marginal yield improvements. And in fact, in the red clover and the balanza clover cover crop treatments, we found significantly higher yields than the control. And, in some cases, up to 20 bushel per acre improvement. So that I thought was encouraging in an environment like Worcester, where we have not necessarily the highest yields possible in the state, but still pretty good, reasonable production capacity. I should also note that we tried this experiment in South Charleston, where we have a notably higher yield environment that year in 2016. We averaged around 225 bushels an acre for our corn. And we also found no yield differences between the cover crop and the control, suggesting that there was no negative impact of the cover crop. But in this case, the dense shade of that higher yield environment contributed to poor stand establishment of the cover crop. And I should also note that that particular year, June and July, was quite dry, and that also limited our cover crop establishment. So in this example, the cover crop was not successful. So, it's a realistic, comparison in another environment that we need to be aware of, potential failure of the cover crop in this case. And so that's, highlighting some of the challenges. So just a quick summary. We overall found that interseeding into corn at V5 did not pose any risks to corn yield. And in general, interseeded legumes offered potential yield benefits in the future, not necessarily in the first year that you try them, but in the subsequent years that you plant crops into those areas. And this was probably due to the nitrogen contributed by those legumes. I should also note that successful interseeding really does require reasonable rainfall in June and July to get the cover crop stand established, and that's true pretty much wherever you plant them. So rainfall is still helpful, and in higher yield environments, sometimes too much shade can inhibit the cover crop establishment. That's typical in 30-inch corn rows, when you've got higher than 220 bushels an acre. However, my work going forward is aimed at addressing this constraint. So we're looking at the relative shade tolerance of different cover crop species, and we're working to try and identify cover crop species that can tolerate that shady environment under the corn stand. And we're also looking at maybe reducing the amount of shade by potentially planting corn in wider spacing. So those are some of the areas that we're going to explore in the future. So if you're interested, please feel free to reach out to me at Ohio State ATI. I'd be happy to hear any interest you have in this area of research. Thanks again.
Thank you, Ryan. This is a topic that I get a lot of questions about, and it's interesting to see the work that you're doing and how that helps us understand what species may be successful if you're thinking about using this type of cover crop management. Our next speaker is Dr. Vinayak Shettikar. He is a research scientist in the Department of Food, Agricultural, and Biological Engineering. And today he's going to talk about his work in the area of soil health and water quality.
Hello, my name is Vinayak Shettikar. I'm a research scientist in the Food, Ag, and Biological Engineering Department here at Ohio State. And I'm going to share some of our soil health related research today. I'll share my screen. So we know already that soil health practices like no-till cover crops, they improve soil health for sure, and they also help improve the profitability. Just to make the point, here is a snapshot of a research that we did looking at a range of soil health practice history at different fields, in different fields. So starting from a farm that doesn't necessarily have any soil health practices, so kind of a conventional tillage type of a system, going into more of a transitional system and a long-term system that has been practicing cover crops and no-till. And there is pretty good evidence in the literature, studies across the region that can show you that over time, when you're adopting these practices, the soil health improves and the indicators show that improvement. And here is a core indicator of soil health, which is the soil organic matter. You can see that it's a pretty good trend there. Also, similar to other properties, the biological indicators that show a pretty good improvement over time. So, and you can see that there are some differences in a transitional versus a mature system. So the evidence is pretty clear, but what we're trying to answer is, does good soil health automatically mean good water quality coming off of that farm? And if there are water quality benefits, would those benefits be the same from a field that's been under 30 or 40 years of these soil health practices versus a field that's just recently being transitioning into these practices, or a conventional field? We're also exploring whether we can scale up these benefits, the water quality benefits of soil health practices. So this is what our research group is currently involved with, looking at the connection between soil health and water quality, especially as it relates to sustainable agroecosystems. So how do we do that? We have a few funded projects through North Central Region SARE and AFRI. A big part of our projects is conducting paired studies or paired field studies. So we select somewhat of similar soils in the same vicinity, but then fields that have been long-term under cover crop systems, or fields that may be transitional to a soil health system, and then compare those with the fields that are under a conventional management. And in the field, we are conducting soil health measurements in those fields. And then at the edge of the field, we monitor the water quality coming out of the tile drain outlets, as well as the surface runoff from those fields. So we're monitoring both of these continuously for flow and water quality. And typically we're monitoring the nutrient losses, the nitrogen and phosphorus losses occurring from at the edge of fields. This work is very much preliminary work right now. So we're still in year 1 and 2 of our research. So here is some preliminary data just to give you an idea what we intend to eventually get out of the data that we're collecting, is kind of a comparison between how the concentrations, which is these triangles, the concentrations of nutrients would look like compared to a healthy soil field versus a conventional field. Some of our research will also give us insights on how the hydrologic behavior of these fields is, and if we're seeing more of an infiltration versus runoff in one field or another. There is many benefits of using this data, and then what the field collected data is what informs our modeling efforts at watershed scales that we can then use to scale up our findings at watershed scales in terms of assessing how soil health is impacting water quality. So that's in a crux what we do. I would be happy to answer any questions there may be after this session. Thank you for your time.
Thanks, Vinayak. I think this research connecting the dots between soil health and water quality is incredibly important. So thank you for sharing it with us today. Our final speaker is Dr. Doug Jackson-Smith. He is a professor in the School of Environment and Natural Resources, and he's going to share his research looking at trends in soil health practices across Ohio. So I'll hand it off to you now, Doug.
Hi, I'm Doug Jackson-Smith, a professor here in the School of Environment and Natural Resources at Ohio State University. And I'd like to talk this morning about the utilization of soil health practices among farmers here in Ohio. I'd like to use my presentation to really address three key questions, really what we know about how widely soil health management practices are used, what we know about the trajectory and the rate of change occurring in that space, and a little bit of commentary about what we know about what drives or holds back producers from using soil management. For my talk, I'm going to speak specifically about three types of practices: no-till or reduced tillage, cover crop use, and diversified crop rotations. We're also going to draw upon three different sources of data: the Census of Agriculture, remote sensing, and a survey I conducted, a statewide survey of Ohio farmers in 2020. Now, a quick bit of history. You will probably all know this intuitively, but before 1970, farms in Ohio really raised quite a few different diverse commodities. And it was around 1970 that we saw the real rise of the corn and soybean market and the shift in our production systems towards much more specialized agricultural production to the point where those crops dominate about 85% of our cropland use right now. This is also shown in the Census of Agriculture when you look at more recent data that show that soybean and corn continue to increase their share of the total acreage with continued declines in the producers that weave into their rotations wheat, oat, and barley, and then the graph on the right, hay and pasture. The Ag Census does also collect data on conservation practice use. It's conducted every 5 years. The most recent data we have is from the 2017 Census of Agriculture. There'll be a new one in 2022 conducted in 2023. So it'll be a year and a half or so before we know that. But the census data for 2012 and 2017 give us some information about the extent of acreage that's covered by practices such as cover crops, no-till or reduced tillage, or the number of farms or proportion of farms who utilize those practices. And I've highlighted here just some key points, which are that the total number of farms that use cover crops is roughly around 13% according to the census, and that covers about 6.5% of our cropland acreage in 2017. Those numbers, the cropland acreage is up quite a bit. It's doubled, but it's still less than 10%. But the percentage of farms is actually growing much more slowly. And when you look at the combined use of no-till and reduced tillage, you'll see that about 2/3 of our acres are managed with those practices, but only about half of our producers are using them. A couple of years ago, scientists developed ways of using regular satellite imagery to calculate and identify the use of no-till and the use of cover crops across the Midwest particularly. And there's a nice website you can go to explore what they call this Optis data. And it's seen as kind of an independent way of measuring trends through time in the use of those practices. And I want to show you what that looks like for Ohio. What Optis tells us is that no-till as a percent of cropland acres in Ohio and neighboring states has actually remained within the same band, roughly 30-35%, for about 15 years. And the blue line is Ohio. You can see that we've seen years in which greater or lesser shares of our land has been managed using no-till practices, but that in recent years, in fact, it's down a little bit and then climbing back up. When you add in reduced tillage, then you'll see that the overall numbers are higher, about 50 to 60%, but that the trends are very flat for 15 years. So we see years when it is higher and years when it is lower, predictably based on crop rotations and weather. When it comes to cover crops, the numbers are actually much lower, as we saw in the census data. In most states, the proportion of cropland that's managed using cover crops is still below 5%. Ohio, particularly, that blue line with yellow dots, we've only reached the 5% mark in more recent years. And the trajectory is increasing in recent years in most states, but it's still a relatively small proportion. So we did the survey in 2020 of Ohio farmers. It was well regarded. We got a 42% response rate, about 850 farms across the state that were weighted to represent the size and types of farms that we know we have here. And it gathered a lot of information, including information about the use of conservation practices. We asked specifically about a number of practices, but I'll highlight 4: cover crops, no-till, extended crop rotations, and manure use. And you can see here on the slide how we defined those particular terms. And we looked specifically at their use of that in 2019, the year before the survey went out. Overall, what we found is about 17% of farmers in Ohio in our survey reported the use of cover crops in 2019, and about 40% used no-till or extended crop rotations. You'll note that those are higher numbers for cover crops and lower for no-till than we see in the census. We also noticed that manure use is used on about 70% of farms in Ohio still. Obviously, those who have access to it from their own livestock or live in areas where livestock can make that available. We then broke these data down by farm type, and there's some very interesting patterns. The most common, or the industry in which no-till is most frequently used is clearly in the cash grain sector, followed by the dairy sector. No-till is very common in the hay sector. In fact, it's probably farmers who rely principally on hay, but it kind of goes without saying. By contrast, dairy farmers are the most likely to be reporting the use of cover crops, extended crop rotations, and the use of manure as a fertilizer input. We also broke this down by farm size, and we see some fairly predictable patterns that larger farms who operate more acreage are significantly more likely to use cover crops and no-till practices. Whereas with extended crop rotations, other than the smallest category, it's a pretty consistent group of about half of farmers in each of those size categories who are able to utilize extended crop rotations. And the same is true for manure. In fact, where manure is slightly more likely to be used on the smaller operations than larger operations. Key questions in terms of understanding these patterns would be, why aren't more farmers using cover crops after a lot of money and effort being spent to promote them? Or why has conservation tillage, no-till, and reduced tillage remained relatively flat for 15 years? And what prevents the use of more widespread diversification in the crop rotation? And we have some hints from the literature and from research. I can't get into the details today, but economically, there's definitely reasons that affect, diversifying rotations, using cover crops, and even implementing no-till does require direct investments, but also indirect costs in terms of the impact, say, diversifying a rotation or using a cover crop has on your main crops. And when you factor in those investments and the slow return on investments, there's clearly economic factors holding back farmers from doing that. Equally important, probably access to tenure and decision making. A lot of our land is rented, and dealing with landowners versus operators has been a barrier. I also hear quite a bit from farmers, and we know this from research, that technical problems or practical problems are terribly important, and the availability of information, uneven performance when farmers try to do it in the field, and logistical challenges in terms of implementing these practices successfully continue to discourage farmers from using them more widely. And finally, farm programs and crop insurance programs historically have not favored the use of these practices. That's changing in current years, but it's certainly one in which farmers are worried about what that might mean. And my time is up, so I will stop on time, and appreciate everybody coming to this morning, and look forward to hearing more.
Thanks, Doug. I think these insights are incredibly valuable to help inform research so that we can increase adoption of these practices in the future. I'd like to take a moment and thank all of our speakers. Lots of excellent information about research that's currently going on has been shared. And now we'd like to take some time to answer the questions that you have for our speakers. If you haven't already entered your question, please be sure to use the Q&A feature, and I'm going to pass it off to Tony to take over handling the questions.
Thanks, Elizabeth. I've got a couple questions. Soledad, I'll turn these to you first, since they were posed during your presentation. The first question: do the various BMPs listed for improved soil health via enhanced microbial activity have the same impacts, plus or minus, on GHG emissions?
Hi, thank you. I don't have a clear answer for these questions. They don't have a lot of experience in greenhouse gas emissions, but I do know there are different labs and research teams that are looking into this concept. I know there is definitely concern about how many of these practices could be influencing greenhouse gas emissions, but off the top of my head, I cannot think of one being better than other in mitigating greenhouse gas emissions.
Okay. The second question I have for you then is, does the enzyme alkaline phosphate release legacy P into the environment? And if so, under what conditions?
Okay, so for this question, my understanding about how alkaline phosphatates work is that it works on organic phosphorus. So I guess it's really going to depend on which form that phosphorus is in, and if the enzyme can then free in the phosphorus to make it more available to the plant. In terms of what conditions, I've read some research that talks about the importance of carbon, nitrogen, moisture in terms of releasing, in terms of the activity of alkaline phosphatase.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to ask this one to the group. So whoever speaks first, go ahead and we'll see if others want to chime in after someone responds. What can be the influence of cover crop rotation in the life of soil bacteria? I'll repeat that. What can be the influence of crop rotation in the life of soil bacteria? Steve, you want to tackle that?
Yeah, I mean, I guess you could go after that question a few different ways. We know that crops in general have a large influence on microbial communities, and that happens temporally as well. You know, it happens over the course of many growing seasons, but it also happens throughout the course of a single growing season. And as that typically in Ohio, where we would be growing cash crops, and as those crops get established and the root systems established, the microbial communities, the bacteria, the amount of microbes, the microbial biomass and abundance, and the activity would subsequently increase. And so, you know, in a general sense, there's a lot of work that's been done about, and Soledad could certainly speak more to this than I could, but in terms of as crop rotations increase and above ground diversity, our plant communities increase, you know, how does that affect below ground communities? And typically we see a positive relationship there, but certainly not always. So I guess that's kind of my first initial thoughts. There might be other thoughts out there as well.
Soledad, you have any thoughts on that?
And the only thing that I will add to what Steve said is that, you know, if you have different plant species, each, you know, from the bacterial perspective, each one sort of tastes differently. So the bacteria that might like to eat from or live around corn might not be the same as the one that likes to live around soybean or clover if we're thinking about a cover crop. So that's one of the mechanisms through which the specific rotation might influence the bacteria, just because of how they each taste different.
Vinayak, you have anything to share?
And I think both of them covered pretty much. I don't know if I know more than what was shared.
Okay. Doug, I'll ask you this question first, and then we'll see what else the group has to say. What is more important, the waste of cover crops whose organic matter presents high rates of mineralization, or residues that provide a higher % of stable organic matter?
Great question. And as a sociologist, I can give you a lightly informed opinion, but I'll probably bounce that to my colleagues. I think there are trade-offs in terms of goals for using cover crops. If you're trying to build soil organic matter and store carbon and improve soil tilth, certain cover crops are going to be more effective if what you're trying to do is ensure surface processes are different, but you can suppress weeds, achieve other kinds of goals. I think there'll be different species, but maybe I'll invite in Steve or someone else to jump on that one.
Well, I'll just, if we think back to Ryan's presentation and his Swiss Army knife, slide, that's a really nice way to think about cover crops. And, maybe at some point we will stop. Here our language fails a bit. Maybe we'll stop just lumping all non-cash crops into this or non-harvested crops into a cover crop kind of general bucket. There's a lot of other words that we might be able to use to kind of describe them. But I think, I ask this question to growers sometimes. What would you rather have? It's the same question that you've asked here. It's like, organic matter building and stabilization of organic matter versus mineralization. And of course, growers want both. They, in the short term, they want mineralization of soil residues to feed crops and to stimulate nutrient cycling for a productive crop that year. But in the long term, they want stabilization processes that build organic matter. And we need, in a highly functional agricultural system by design, or from a concept place anyways, we'd really like to see both of those happening concurrently, that there's mineralization, release of organic matter, as well as building of organic matter. So they're both important, and it depends on the field and the history and where you're at and your management goals, all that good stuff. But typically more organic matter is better. And so we want to balance some organic matter building with some mineralization release of that to feed the crops.
Vinayak, I'll turn it over to you on that one too. You've been shaking your head agreeing, I think. So what else can you add for that?
Yeah, I was gonna just say that, well, one depends on the other. If you have more fresh residue coming in, you're eventually gonna have more passive organic matter, or humus, as we call it. One thing that we did some long-term simulations of carbon accumulation, and many people have done it, the Century model, the Roth-C model. One thing that is clear is the amount of biomass that's coming into your system decides where your system or the soil is going to end up in terms of the organic matter accumulation. So if you have a consistent rate of residue coming in, it's just going to come to a plateau over time in terms of the organic matter buildup. But if you start adding more residue than that steady state system, then you have the potential to accumulate more. Again, it depends on the weather and the climate and the soils. And the other side, as it relates to farmers, may be that how much can you manage in terms of the fresh residue, or even the dried residue. So I guess you have to have that balance to be able to, but the more the better is, I think I agree with Steve, the more the better for the soil health itself. But how much can a farmer manage with the kind of tools and equipment they got is, again, another consideration there.
Thanks to all three of you for that. Soledad, this might be one in your wheelhouse here, but we'll start with you and then see if anyone wants to add to. What can be the influence of What can be the influence of crop rotation in the life of soil bacteria and the role on organic matter and soil microbial interactions?
Thanks, Tony. I think the first part of the question we already answered. In terms of the role of organic matter, I think it ties up to what both Steve and Vinayak were just saying right now. The more organic matter you have in the soil, the healthier is going to be your system. And, organic matter, the microbes are, in one hand, part of that organic matter, but on the other hand, they're using that organic matter. So in terms of the role of organic matter, greater organic matter is going to result in, as what we've seen on data. And I think Vinayak had a nice figure that showed some of that. Greater organic matter, we see greater microbial activity and biomass in general, but microbes are also part of that organic matter. So when we measure organic matter, we're also measuring some of those microbes that are, alive. Some of them are also dead, but as well as plant residues and other aspects.
Anybody else want to add to that?
Just to add, I guess don't want to forget the role that the fungi play in that system as well. So I guess one of the graphs that I was showing there was also, some indicators that relate to the presence of fungi in the system and how they play a role. So I think when it comes to soil biology, I guess the both of those aspects are important.
Okay, very good. Doug also added some thoughts in the chat box if those of you listening want to read that. A real quick one here: what cover crops are best for pasture, in parentheses, cows? Anybody have any thoughts on that? I can add a few things, being probably the animal science person here. I think in terms of that, it goes back to what's your goals. So the time of when you're gonna handle cover crops, what's the time frame of being able to utilize those cover crops. But when we're talking about cows, I think some things: total digestible matter, fiber content, protein and energy content of those forbs or cover crops or forages that we're going to utilize. The other thing then too that goes into that is the palatability to those cows. There are certain species that palatability may become more of an issue, even though they may be conducive for other species. Cattle may not like them as much. So those would be some other things. I'm going to ask real quick one more question regarding the effect on soil bacteria. There was data shown that over time with rotations and cover crops, the fungi bacteria ratio in the soil increased. Vinayak?
Yes, that is So what is the question there is what I'm trying to.
Yeah, I was trying to, I
Uh,
guess, reconfirm that that's what that ratio was meaning.
Yeah, I guess just to, expand on that, the data that I presented, the reason I wanted to present that is like it relates to some of the CO2 emission aspects of the soil health. And the more fungal biomass you have, the more efficient the system is in terms of the specific respiration. And I'm not the expert to talk about this. I'm not a soil biologist, so I'm not. But based on what I know is the systems that have more fungal to bacteria ratio, they get more efficient in terms of processing the carbon and nitrogen. So to some extent, it is a better solution towards reducing the greenhouse gas emissions. So that's my reason why I was showing the data. Of course, there is more benefits, and then probably Soledad might comment on that rather than me.
Okay, very good. For the sake of time, Ed and David, in the Q&A, you have responses from the speakers to those questions, but for the sake of everyone's schedules, and a couple of our speakers do have to move on to things. Again, thank you for attending the survey or the program today.